Welcome to Cattle Connect, your insight into Alabama's beef cattle industry. I'm your host, Kayla Greer, and this is Cattle Connect, brought to you by the Alabama Cattlemen's Association. Welcome back to the Cattle Connect podcast. We are moving boldly across the legislative calendar here in the state of Alabama as Erin, Beasley, and I have spent a lot of time over at the State House during this legislative session. We are 15 days in, which means that we're halfway through the session already. And a lot of the time has already been spent talking about crime, some tax cut packages, immigration. There's been some talk around Veterans Affairs. There's been a lot of things kind of dominating the airwaves over at the State House so far this session. And now that we've reached this halfway point, we're kind of pivoting to get attention put in places where things need to be taken care of, such as establishing the state's budgets for the year. Some of those big projects that have to cross the finish line before they can gavel out on May 19th. So this week marked kind of a midpoint, not only in the session, but because it is the week between two breaks that were held during the month of March. So last week, the week of March 10th, we had a district work week where the legislators went back to their districts and worked kind of from their remote offices there. And then next week will be another break, and it's the traditional legislative spring break. And so joining me today in studio to talk a little bit about where we are at the mid-session point is Erin Beasley. She is our point lobbyist here at the Cattlemen's Association, and I just work alongside her and follow her orders. So, Erin, thanks for joining us, and let's talk about some of this stuff.
Thanks, Kayla. I don't know about that. Most of the time, you're having to keep me back in line and, hey, this is what's going on. You've done a good job this session keeping track of things, and I know there's been several days when you've been over there because I've been elsewhere, and having both of us is definitely a very, very good thing for the association to continue working on behalf of our members. But as you mentioned, we're halfway through. It's been a little bit of a interesting session. They all are in their own way. And I would say that, this is the second year in a row that we've experienced, this basically 2-week break that we have again this year. And so that was a new thing that came up last year, and they decided to do it again this year. And so that's kind of just put a different, it does really put that like midway break in the session, gives you a minute to kind of catch your breath. Mm-hmm. It also makes it feel like the leadership in both the Senate and the House, it really does allow them to kind of game plan the session out. And so what we've seen is that in the first 15 days, kind of leading up to that first break, and now we're in a break, we just finished 1 week, we'll go back to another break. You can tell that each chamber had a set of initiatives that they wanted to get accomplished in the first 15 days.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that was really evident. And you look at the Senate, their initiatives very much were related to a lot of the bills that we saw related to illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. We saw some items that were related to
Veterans Affairs came out of Senate first.
Veterans Affairs was one that, you could tell they tackled first. And then, just an onslaught of bill introduction.
Oh my gosh.
Lots of bills.
So many bills introduced this session.
Ton of bills. And then if we flip over to the House side, what we've seen is, and we heard Speaker Ledbetter talk about this before we ever had the session kick off, but they really, I feel like they kind of focused in on a lot of the crime bills.
Right.
They've had that. They've already worked through sunset for a lot of the boards and agencies that operate in a sunset law.
Right.
So we've already had that. There's been a lot of back on the Senate, a lot of confirmations that have been completed. So you kind of are seeing a lot of those procedural things that are getting done.
Housekeeping bills.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Housekeeping bills. For us, I would say that, as far as what we do, we're there to watch out for the cattle industry.
That's right. And landowners.
And landowners, that's what we do. And so for us as an association, I'm not going to say it's been the heaviest lift this session because it hasn't.
No.
And that's fine. It doesn't always have to be a heavy lift. So we've been doing a lot of monitoring. We've worked a few bills. We'll talk about that as we get through this podcast. But there are several what I would call kind of ag-related, quasi-ag-related that we can touch on today. A couple of them I think we mentioned in the first podcast we did early in the session when we first kicked off, and so we can kind of roll through those. So do you want to maybe start us off with a couple of like status reports on a couple of them that maybe our members have read about in the political roundup in the magazine? I guess it would have been the month of March, and then just so that y'all know, you'll have that political roundup again in April and in May.
That's right. Yeah, and the April version might look a little similar to the March version, just because some of the bills that have been related to the ag industry might not have been moving as much in the first part of the session, but we expect to see some change in that. So the March to April edition of the political roundup might mirror each other pretty closely, but the April to May is expected to be very different. So saddle up for that. But we'll start out by mentioning our friends over at Alpha. They're working on health plans. So originally, at the beginning of the session, they dropped a Senate version of the bill that was sponsored by Senator Arthur Orr, and we have been told to expect a House version that will drop by the time you guys are listening to this podcast. Maybe we can say tomorrow, but still to be determined on when that House version will drop, and that version of the bill is the one that is expected to work its way through. And so not much movement on that legislation yet, but we will be behind that, as it can greatly benefit a lot of our members who don't have access to employer-provided health plans. And we all know that the cost of health care is very burdensome to a lot of small businesses and farmers particularly. So we'll be looking out and monitoring that legislation. Erin, do you want to talk about axle weights?
So our friends at Alabama Forestry Association, they've been working hard on this bill this session, but SB 110, sponsored by our friend Senator Jack Williams, it has made it through committee. It's awaiting a vote on the Senate floor. And essentially, this bill would be looking at not taking the total weight and changing what we have on trucks, but increasing the axle weights by 10% by axle. So Kayla, instead of looking at total weight on the truck, that won't change. It's still 80,000 with 10% variance.
Right.
But this would be looking at if you had your load distribution and one axle got higher and over the 20,000, you'd have an issue and you could get dinged for it.
That's right. So our friends at Forestry have mentioned a lot of the times that when a truck is stopped and weighed, it might be under that 88,000 with the 80,000 plus the 10% tolerance, but one of the axles is overweight, and so they get dinged or they get ticketed for having that axle too heavy, even though their load is within law. And so this would look at the axle distribution and how it applies there when you're dealing with ALEA and truck drivers. So looking for that to get brought up on the Senate calendar here soon, get a vote for that, and let it head down to the House to get worked down there and help out these guys that are hauling heavy loads across the state.
And finally, the bill that we've probably spent the most time on this session, Kayla, would be SB 185. So for those that don't know, there is a bill that is looking at defining in Alabama state law what the veterinary client-patient relationship is. So that's known as a VCPR.
Right.
And those of us that, are having vets out to the farm and whatnot, we're pretty familiar with this. I think a lot of people are probably more familiar because we've dealt with the veterinary feed directive over the last few years.
That requires a VCPR be in place.
Have to have a VCPR in place. So, just the idea of having a working relationship with your veterinarian is something that we know is really important. With the way that federal guidelines and law has changed, we really have to have that now in order to get the prescriptions that we need to be able to vaccines, antibiotics, all the things that we give to our cattle. That is just part of our basic health management plan at this point.
Right. And there has been a federal code on the VCPR that we as a state have leaned on for years now. And we're getting some pressure from the top to adopt a state code that we can have language here in the state of Alabama codified to define what a VCPR is. And so that's the intent of this bill.
And so currently we are working, the Alabama Vet Medical Association does have this bill. The bill sponsor is Senator Randy Price, one of our good ag friends. And there are a few changes that we'd like to see at us and poultry industry.
That's right.
We'd like to see within the bill. We do feel like it's a little bit cumbersome. And so our hope is that we can work that bill through the process. It's in kind of a standstill right this second while language gets passed back and forth. But our hope is that SB 185 will get it amended and then it can move through the process because, we know that a VCPR is very important for not only the veterinary community, but for us.
Right.
And we very much want a VCPR law in place that is conducive for our two communities to work together and be able to have, good herd health. The thing about a VCPR is it's a law that is going to apply to all types of veterinarians.
Yes, that's
and
right.
all types of animals. And whenever you start talking about all types of animals, that's when things can sometimes get a little sticky with wording. And so those are the types of things that we're working through. But we're very engaged on that bill. We've spent a lot of time on it.
Yeah.
Kayla, I think it's safe to say you and I have learned more about VCPRs than we ever thought we would this session so far.
And reading other state codes and finding things in the federal code. Yeah, we've done a lot of research.
Yeah,
around this one.
It's been a good fact-finding mission, but really happy that we're able to work with Senator Price on it because he is a friend to agriculture. He understands our industry. And so, that makes it nice for us to be able to say, hey, these are our concerns. And he's very willing to work with us and also work with the Vet Medical Association so that we can all find a happy median on it.
Yeah, because everybody can bring a specific story to the table. We can use a specific scenario in the cattle industry, and somebody from a small animal perspective can bring a specific scenario. And so that's what we're doing in this negotiation process. We're talking through some of those scenarios and how this code would apply to each of those, and trying to find something that's going to meet in the middle and work for everyone.
Yeah, which, I have to say 9 times out of 10 with legislation, that really is the name of the game. Mm-hmm. It's all about, how can we find, it's not about always killing the bill.
Right.
I know that like is something that maybe is fun to say, but really, we don't want to, if you've got heartburn, it is a legislative process. Mm-hmm. And process is the key word there. Mm-hmm. But it takes a lot of working through, it's developing relationships, mm-hmm. and we want to be, the type of folks that are over there that, folks know that they can work with us, and mm-hmm. we can find a happy medium that works for all the industries involved. Right. So that one we will continue to monitor. So I think we'll have more to report on probably in the next couple of weeks once we get past the break and stuff on that.
Want to hear more about upcoming beef cattle events? No problem. Visit us online at bamabeef.org/events or check out your latest issue of the Alabama Cattleman magazine.
That kind of wraps up the ag bills. Mm-hmm. Yesterday was kind of a big day in the House.
Yeah, it was. You want to talk about some of that, Erin, as we've looked at some of these tax cut packages that have taken place? It started in the House. It's passed through the House, now headed to the Senate. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, the tax cut package. So going into the session, there was a lot of talk about the fact that the overtime tax exemption from last year's law that got passed.
Which cut state income tax on any hours worked in excess of 40 hours per week.
Yeah, any overtime was exempt from state income tax.
Right.
And so that obviously impacts a lot of Alabamians. Mm-hmm. And it was, it's a great bill. And what we know now is that the fiscal note on that was much more than what was originally predicted.
I think the takeaway from this is that Alabamians work a lot more overtime than anticipated.
There's a lot of overtime. So, nevertheless, that bill, when it was passed, it does have a sunset on it. Mm-hmm. So that is still being talked about, mm-hmm. if it will be sunset or if it will continue on.
Right.
On the flip side, we had one of our budget chairmen, Representative Danny Garrett, this week in the House brought forward another tax cut package that really had great bipartisan support. Mm-hmm. It was a couple of different bills, actually 4 different bills. First of all, Kayla, you'll remember this from a few sessions ago. There was an initiative to eliminate the grocery tax.
The grocery tax, yeah. It was a huge buzz topic a couple years ago.
Yeah, Alabama's one of 10 states that still has a grocery tax. And so a few years ago, legislation passed that if the Education Trust Fund grew at a certain percentage, mm-hmm. then the grocery tax would reduce in rate, mm-hmm. which it did the first year.
Yeah.
So it went down from 4% to 3%. Mm-hmm. After that, the legislation said that, the ETF has to meet that a certain threshold again to drop down to 2.
Right. It has to trigger.
It would have to trigger. Well, that law passed and that's gone on. We had the drop from 4 to 3, but we never went 3 to 2.
Right.
So Representative Garrett brought forward a bill that would actually say, no, we're going to go from 3 to 2 because we've had a lot of budget surpluses the last few years. Alabama is fiscally responsible. They've done a good job, between the tax revenues and then having budgets that are fiscally responsible. They've been able to have surplus packages. And so anyway, grocery tax, it has passed through. It has passed through the House and will go on to the Senate. I think with the bipartisan support it had, that I think there's no doubt it will see that bill get to the governor's desk, and we'll have that grocery tax cut go from 3% to 2%.
Yes, and I think anybody can celebrate that, knowing just how expensive groceries are these days.
Yeah, food's expensive. We definitely know it all too well in our industry. And then there were 3 other bills that were associated with that package that also passed. One would grant municipalities the discretionary authority. They could lower their own sales tax that they have on groceries. So some municipalities put additional tax. We know there's a lot of local additional local taxes on certain goods. So this would give them the authority to actually pull back any that they have on groceries. There was also a bill to increase a tax exemption for seniors that are drawing from retirement. And then finally, there is a increase in the tax exempt income for those families that are making under $60,000 per year.
Okay.
So I saw a quote where Representative Garrett, he talked about the fact that these 4 bills put together affect a lot of Alabamians. And so for a total potential impact of $192 million in tax cuts.
Okay.
So, we'll continue to watch that. It'll head to the Senate. I think that, we could potentially, I guess, see some amendments, but overall, I think that one definitely that group of bills definitely gets to the governor's desk at some point this session.
Right. Like you said, there's a lot of bipartisan support, so a lot of action moving that way. All right. So that's kind of where we're at here at this midway point, day 15. Erin, let's talk a little bit about looking ahead the next 15 days. So just reviewing some Alabama civics real quick. The legislature has 105 calendar days to meet 30 days for session, to go in session for 30 days. So when we're referring to day 15, day 14, whatever day we're referring to, that's out of the 30 days that they have to meet. So if they gavelled in on February 4th, that means they have until May 19th to meet for 30 days. And so we're on day 16 of that. So when we come back from the break, we'll be starting off on day 17 and working through day 30 to the end here. So, Erin, where are we at as we look ahead to the next 14 or so days of session and getting all of this stuff to the finish line?
Well, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, there is a ton of bills that have been introduced. I don't even know what the tally is at this moment. I should probably do that, but it's a bunch of them. There is still a lot in front of us, but per the Constitution, they have to pass 2 budgets.
Right.
So that's like first and foremost.
That's like why we're here.
It is why we are here. The Alabama legislature must pass a general fund budget and an education trust fund budget. So I would expect that as we come back to day 17 and kind of look ahead in the next few weeks, those budgets will begin to move because they've got to go through the process. There will be a ton of amendments. A lot of changes. So those budget chairmen are fixing to get really, really busy with those,
right.
Which they probably already have been because they're trying to get them ready and get them, meet with all the groups that want to make requests. So you have that in front of you. We've mentioned, a couple of bills today that have to get
maybe they're part of way through the process, but not to the finish line yet.
So you've got Forestry's bill with axles, you've got Alpha Health Plan. So those are certainly some that we'll have to move along and get through. We also can expect that anything that we talked about that was in the Senate that has passed already in the first half, it's got to go to the House and get through that.
It's a 2-part system.
2-part system, so they got to get through both houses. So you can kind of see that script flipped, as we look ahead to the second half. And then, as is always the case, you never know what's going to pop up in between. But I think that probably there's a pretty good narrative as to what we can expect to see. And then we'll be watching to see what else pops up. But, it will definitely get busy. It always does when you start getting budgets moving. I've even seen something mentioned about a potential gaming bill. So you just never know. You really never know what's going to pop up. That has not been a topic of conversation really this session. It always is.
Right.
In some shape, form, or fashion. So you've just got a few of those that are, they always have the potential to pop up. And really really kind of wreck a session in a way.
Yeah.
Because there's something that we know is a really contentious subject.
Yeah, just bog down the airwaves. And it becomes something that can be played with in terms of using it as leverage against or for something else that you either do or don't want to pass.
Yeah. So that's part of the game. But we will, continue to watch everything. We're going to keep working on the VCPR bill, SB 185 with Senator Price.
And as we transition into working for the budgets or working with the budgets, there are a couple of line items in both of those budgets that we're going to monitor. We want to see either leveled or increased funding. We alluded to some of this stuff in our first podcast that kind of kicked off the session this year. But of course, we're always watching the Department of Agriculture and Industry's budget there, which lives in the general fund primarily. We want to see funding for career and technical education, for those FFA programs. And then there's also a $40,000 line item for junior cattlemen programs in the Education Trust Fund that we want to see left in place. And so we'll be working for some of that. And then as we've talked about a couple of times during some of our legislative discussions, we're working for increased funding for the Conservation Incentive Program that's housed with the Alabama Agriculture and Conservation Development Commission. So they're in the general fund budget. Already met with the chairman and expressed the need there, and he seemed favorable. So we'll see what happens there.
And Kayla, I guess we'll just kind of round out, aside from being over there and working legislation, there's also a lot of activity that goes on in terms of events for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, coming up on April 1st, it's FFA Day on the Hill. So
That's always a good one.
We're going to have a bunch of blue coats that are in town. We get to actually host a bunch of those kids here at the building, have legislators come and talk to them. So great interaction day. That'll be a lot of fun. The Cattle Women's Association, they're supposed to bring their leadership to visit with us in May.
ACWA Day on the Hill.
Yeah, so that's going to be fun. Really excited. Shelby reached out to us. Shelby Easterling, they're present. And, we're going to take them over and show them a little bit about the process. We also will have the Cattlemen's legislative reception.
Yep, Steak and Spirits.
Steak and Spirits is coming up. That's in the beginning of April. And then probably one of I know it's some of the senators' favorite event of the year. But,
and their staff.
But we do the big breakfast with Poultry and Egg Association and some of the senators here. That'll be actually the day after I get back from a trip to D.C. So
no rest for the weary.
No rest, but we'll have Senator Allen will do his biscuits. Senator Williams is planning to do his pancakes. We'll do the beef, of course, and then our friends at Poultry will have the omelets. So there's always a lot going on. Heck, tomorrow we've got on the federal side, we've got Congressman Rogers that's going to be here at the building, having a little get together for him. So this time of year is just a lot of interaction, a lot of busyness. So there's, it's just when you talk about legislative process and just being engaged on things, there's no rest and no shortage of that happening.
No, not
this time of year.
No, not at all. And that is what we're going to leave you guys with. Of course, we always want to encourage you. If you have a piece of legislation that maybe you're concerned about or you have questions about, our phone lines are always open. Please give Erin or myself a call. If we don't know the answer, we can find the answer. And so with that, we're going to leave you with that. We're going to head back over to the Hill for an afternoon of committee meetings as we record this on a Wednesday. And hope that you guys come back next week for more Cattle Connect podcast. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Cattle Connect, brought to you by the Alabama Cattlemen's Association. Be sure to subscribe to get notified when our next episode goes live. And until next time, remember, beef, it's what's for dinner.